I hear it all the time, guys. Like people say, I have a heavily planted tank, you know, so it's very healthy, or I'm gonna set up a heavily planted tank, and then we look at the tank and there's like 3 plants in there. So let me show you what heavily planted is and what it is not by looking at my 30-ish tanks. So first, here we go. Here's tank number 1. This tank is not heavily planted. I wouldn't even call this a planted tank. Yes, there are 3 plants in here. This is not heavily planted by any means, and I think we can all agree to that. Let's look over here. This is my 75-gallon 4-foot tank, and we can see we got a ton of Amazon sword all throughout the back. We got some dwarf sag. We have some cryptocorn, floating plants. This is not heavily planted. We look over here. We have a smaller tank. This guy seems to have some Java fern, and that's it. Not heavily planted. Here's my chaos jar. It has an absolute ton of plants inside of it, but really it's not heavily planted because it just has micro sword all around the inside. The middle, there's essentially nothing there. And there is a couple Java fern. Even this, I would not say is heavily planted, but it does look to be heavily planted. You wouldn't know that it's not unless you built it, and we know that stuff doesn't grow in the middle because there's some rock there. Now, this tank used to be heavily planted before I took all the plants out for one of my scapes, but now it's not. Even this tank is not heavily planted. Here's one of my 20 gallons. This one is close to being heavily planted, but it's not. You can see there's a ton of places to plant plants all along the front, and really all this plant matter here stems from just one single point, and then all the leaves build off that. So this is getting close. This is probably moderately planted, but it's still not enough to say heavily planted. Guys, let's go ahead and take a look in the garage. We got about 20 tanks in the garage, and let's look at each of them, all right? So if we look here, not heavily planted, there's like 2 plants planted, right? I'm going on a rant, guys, but people who say they have a heavily planted tank and then their tank looks like one of these, it's not heavily planted. Not heavily planted. No, this one's barely planted, moderately planted, moderately planted, barely any plants in there. This one I throw all my plants, but still not heavily planted. That tank, of course it's not heavily planted. The cichlids would tear it up. Let's look over here. This may be the only one that's close on the cusp of being heavily planted, because all the area up front is starting to be taken over by the jungle veil, and then these stem plants are taking over this area. You see this one stem plant is starting to hop and intermingle within the jungle veil. This one's probably close to being heavily planted, but not quite yet. These ones down here, not heavily planted. No, no, no. These ones are all lowly planted. What's the opposite of heavily? Lightly planted. Lightly planted, lightly planted, lightly planted. So guys, if your tank doesn't have more plant coverage than any of the tanks I showed you, then it's not heavily planted. Period. I was hoping that'd be more dramatic.